Hi, welcome. This is Thomas Hedlund again. This is the third in a series of YouTube videos I'm doing on emotional self-mastery and competence. Today's video is going to be a brief video on how fear affects our thinking. There's some very amazing kinds of information that can help explain why suddenly people lose their adult functions under stress in relationships. So if you happen to like the video, please feel free to like it, perhaps subscribe or tell your friends. And we're going to just start right off into this with some information on your brain. All right. There are 4 different memory systems in the brain. You know, we have our thinking brain, which is like our executive functions. You know, this is the part of your brain starts about 8 to 12 years old that realizes there's no such thing as Santa Claus. Then you have your limbic and emotional memory, which is your kind of midbrain. And then below that, you have your midbrain cerebellum. That's your motor memory. And then at the very base of the brain, your brain stem, that's your state memory. That's the one that regulates your life functions. And these develop from the bottom up. So state memory, then motor memory, then emotional memory, and then last, but certainly not least, is cognitive memory. The problem that we're going to look at is what happens to cognitive memory sometimes when we most need it in relationships. So the way that this happens to work is that as these systems in the brain mature and develop from infancy forward, the brain functions very best when the top part of the brain, the neocortex, the frontal lobes, can regulate and control the lower systems in the brain. That's what works best. However, for a variety of different circumstances and reasons, this is not always the case. But basically, we want our thinking functions to be able to rationally review and decide on our emotional states, our actions, and so on. So what I'm going to try and show you here is that in optimal development, you know, the brain develops in a way so that each portion of the brain sequentially acquires a certain set of skills. Now, those are not inherent. Those are learned skills. They're internalized from the environment. Now, there are a couple things that can really severely affect this that I just want to touch on with you. The first is developmental neglect, which means basically you didn't get all the information and the stimulation that you needed in childhood. So the top portion of your brain, your frontal lobes and your emotional brain are not as fully robust and developed as they need to be. The lower parts of the brain, the midbrain and the brain stem, are working just fine, but they can override those upper functions. The other thing that can happen is you can have developmental trauma, in which case, events happen and they impair the lower part. They preload the lower parts of the brain, the midbrain and the brainstem, with additional or extraordinary amounts of stress. And even though the top parts of the brain may have developed properly, they lose some of their ability to cover and restrain the emotional brain from overriding. This is one of the things that we see in what is classically known as post-traumatic stress, where memories, flashbacks occur, and for no apparent rational reason, we're overreacting to events in the past rather than in the present. And then alas, and sadly, the worst of all, in some instances, there are cases where there's both developmental neglect and trauma. So what happens is the bottom portion of the brain is loaded with stress and reactivity, and the top part of the brain didn't fully develop, and that's where we will lose our most capacity to be able to regulate our emotions, make good decisions, be introspective, and to evaluate the circumstances that we are in from moment to moment. And again, when this happens, the brain works very fine when it's calm. If it's had adequate development. But under stress, and this is what I'm going to focus on today, under stress, we regress. So we revert to earlier brain systems. So this is going to be the take home for this particular video. Fear changes the way we think. Fear changes the way we think. I'm deeply indebted to Dr. Bruce Perry and childtrauma.org. All the graphics that you will see in this video, I have borrowed from them and their website over the years. So let's go through this, and I want to share with you exactly how this happens to work. When we are calm, we are using the part of our brain that functions and develops between 15 and 30 years of age. So what that means is our sense of time is out into the future. We can see the big picture. Our neocortex and subcortex parts of the brain are functioning adequately to give us objective information about our environment. Our cognition, we're able to think abstractly, around 12, 13, 14, 15 years of age. And into our 20s, we start to develop abstract thinking. And our mental state in this is calm. So this is the part of our brain that basically was developing and acquiring skills to regulate our emotions, to have perspective, that is acquired between 15 and 30 years of age. Now, here's where it starts to get very interesting, because it's just as soon as we become aroused, things start changing inside your brain. And right away, our thinking goes from an extended future, or sense of time, down into days and hours. We're not able to see as far or think as far into things. We're dropping down now into our subcortex and our emotional brain. So we're beginning to think more emotionally. And our cognition, as soon as we go into arousal, we start thinking in concrete terms. What's concrete? It means black or white, all or nothing. When you're in your higher functions, you're able to see gray, shades of gray in all circumstances. But as soon as you become aroused, you go into all or nothing, black or white, good or bad thinking. This is the part of your brain that developed between 8 and 15 years of age. And you could just perhaps stop and think about the sophistication that an 8 to a 15-year-old young man or woman has in terms of, as they're trying to learn how to manage their emotions, develop their identity, navigate social relationships. So that's the 18 to 15-year-old part of the brain, just with arousal that starts. And so the next stage of this is as we become more aroused and we go into alarm. Now our sense of time drops to hours and minutes. And we're down into our emotional brain, the limbic brain, and our midbrain, which are the action circuits. So our responses are going to be far more drastic. And now we are thinking emotionally. This is the part of the brain that developed between 3 and 8 years of age. Now, I think it goes without saying that you don't want the part of your brain that developed skills between 3 and 8 years of age to be trying to make the decisions in your adult relationships with all their complexity. And this is where the problem comes into play. My mentor and friend John Bradshaw coined the term spontaneous age regressions, because what happens when some of these old memories and things light up, we lose our adult function, we lose our sense of perspective, and we actually begin to behave quite childlike. You could be very sophisticated, have advanced degrees, and still, if you happen to get triggered in this way and you're not able to restore yourself to calm, then all of a sudden you're going to be behaving more childlike, and most destructive of all, a way of thinking about this is when you're in long-term relationships, friendships, employee relationships, marriages, family relationships, you're going to be in those relationships for a very, very long time. So you want to be implementing solutions that foster well-being and goodwill for the length of the relationship. The problem occurs when these more drastic measures take place and we use more extreme skills and behaviors that actually can do damage to the long-term relationship. And this is where some of the real trouble in human relationships comes from. Now we're down to, I haven't even talked about fear yet. Once we hit fear, good old rock bottom solid fear, then what happens is where our sense of time is down to hours and minutes. What I've noticed over the years as I became familiar with this is you can actually hear it in people's language. I can't stand this for another minute. I can't take any more of this. The language will even reflect kind of the state of mind that you're in. You're down into your midbrain and your brainstem. Those are your action circuits and your state memory circuits. And you're reacting now. Some of the biggest problems in relationships all stem from the fact that people are reacting to one another. They're not able to manage their emotions. They're not able to regulate their emotions and their feelings, and so they act and react more drastically, sometimes reacting to one another. And this is where what happens in long-term relationships, since both parties can be doing this, is where you start to get highly choreographed, very predictable arguments and outcomes once this gets started. And then this is the part of your brain that developed during your toddler years, between 1 and 3 years old. Obviously, you do not want your toddler running your adult relationship. It's going to be a troublemaker for you. And then finally, and just to cover it, if people happen to go into a state of terror, there's no sense of time. And, they're down into their autonomic brainstem activity, and they're just reflexive. You might see people trembling, shaking, unable to speak, because the other thing that happens is as these stressors accelerate in the brain, there's a couple of factors that happen. One is you start to lose your language. As you regress into earlier states of brain, you don't have the same ability to articulate yourself as you might have as if you were calm. So that's one thing that can happen is you lose your perspective, you can lose your language, and you have trouble even taking care of yourself in the relationship. This is sometimes where things like intermittent explosive disorder occur, because people, once they feel that threatened and that afraid, sometimes they'll lash out or explode. So this, under stress, we regress. And as in the very first video I did on self-mastery, the whole essence is for us to be able to bring ourselves back to calm. It's not that these things can happen. It's that we need to have the capacity to bring ourselves back to a state of calm as quickly as possible, so we can do two things basically. We can think about our feelings, and we can feel about our thinking. What does that mean? Like I said, this is what I'm thinking. I wonder how I feel about that. Or this is how I'm feeling. I wonder what I think about that. So human beings work best when we have the ability to use those two functions interchangeably. Now, I'm going to give you a couple tips here is to, because it's one thing to understand this, it's another to try and figure out what the heck do I do with it, okay? Here's a marvelous piece of physiology that I discovered. Your adrenal glands sit right on top of your kidneys. And right above your adrenal glands is the diaphragm for your lungs. So what happens, and because when we go into alarm and fear, we start shallow breathing, and that adrenal response can gain extra, momentum in our bloodstream and in our hormones. So what happens is we need to find some way to shut that off. Something as simple as a few deep breaths. A few deep breaths pushes the diaphragm back down on the adrenals, and it interrupts the adrenal response. So taking a time out, taking a few deep breaths, I'm going to walk around the block, calm myself down, come back so we can discuss this more rationally. These are all just great, simple skills that are available to help you learn how to regulate your emotions and benefit from having the emotional intelligence of what they have to share with you. Now, I want to show you a slide here that is shows what happens when fear strikes. And without a lot of descriptive information about this, the slide that you will see on your left, that's the amygdala, that little yellow dot. That's the fear center in the brain. It stores everything you fear, everything you hate, and everything that's ever hurt you. And as you can see, it's operating right now, but the person is thinking logically. This is the same person's brain, and all of a sudden they're shown a very threatening scenario while they're being scanned, and suddenly the right amygdala, we have two of them. Now they're in their right brain, their emotional brain, and look at the extent of the response. This part of your brain is very imprecise. It will similarities, nuances, sights, smells, behaviors, facial expressions can trigger that right emotional amygdala. And all of a sudden, your thinking has changed without you even knowing it. You've gone from thinking logically to emotionally. And then depending upon the extent and severity of that, you may also at that point be overreacting to circumstances, because fundamentally you are reacting to things that are inside your brain rather than present in your environment at that point. You've lost the ability to discriminate between stimuli. It's one of the primary characteristics is that we lose the ability to have stimulus discrimination and to make appropriate responses. And then last, and certainly not least, I'd like to put this little slide in and give you a little bit of information about what we're up against when we do this. Obviously, now there's a mouse on this elephant's trunk, okay? Your conscious brain, the part that you're listening to me right now with, is listening to me at 5,000 bits of information per second. Now, your subconscious brain, all those other memory systems that I mentioned earlier, is processing 4 billion bits of information per second. That's right, 4 billion. So we like to think that mouse is kind of running the show. But what happens when that unconscious brain, gets activated, it can completely override that limited function of our intellect, our rational mind. And all this is manageable. These are skills that easily can be acquired, practiced, learned, and can be then implemented in all kinds of human relationships to enhance your adult function. But I want to make it very clear that we're really, at the mercy of a lot of our unconscious mind. One kind of final thought about the unconscious and subconscious mind, just to give you a little bit more information, is your conscious mind can tell the difference, hopefully, between a good idea and a bad idea. At the level of the subconscious and the unconscious mind, everything is true. So when something gets stimulated, a memory, a flashback, a trigger, it's happening, and it's happening right now. It doesn't matter whether it's true or not, or it's a good idea or a bad idea. That part of your brain is going to act as if this is happening, it's true, and it's happening right now. So that really is going to conclude this particular short video on how fear affects thinking. If you would like to make comments in the section of, or ask questions on the YouTube channel, I'll be sure and try to answer those questions either online or in future videos. And thank you very much for listening.